Hi, everyone. Dan Goodstein here with the Digital Enterprise Institute and IRPA AI. I'm joined today by Carlos Alvarenga. He's a senior advisor to Digital Enterprise Institute and was recently an author of a new book. Carlos, good to be with you again.
See you again, Dan. Thank you for having me here.
So, Carlos, give everybody a little bit of background on yourself, and then I want to ask you about this new book you're writing.
Sure, Dan. So I've had a kind of a dual career, right? I started originally as a journalist, which got me interesting enough to a job ghostwriting a book for a consulting partner at PwC. When the project was finished, you offered me a job as an associate. And so I stayed in consulting and wound up as a partner at Accenture and Ernst & Young. So the one end I had a long career as a management consulting partner, but I've always had this academic role. So I'm an adjunct professor at the University of Maryland and at Georgetown. And I've focused on teaching strategy and risk to MBAs. So it's always been this sort of dual role. And a few years ago, I decided to leave consulting and to dedicate myself to writing full time. And I am working on a new book right now.
So you've advised us and other organizations on a variety of tech topics. This is more of a general business concept, and actually stems from philosophy, I think. So tell me about the book and how did you get to this project?
Sure. So the project has an interesting genesis. About a year ago, I wanted to volunteer some time with nonprofits, and there's a website that you go on called Catch a Fire where you can find projects to work on. I went on the website, and there was a very senior leader, the chairman of a global humanitarian action agency based in Israel. And he had a small project, and the project was helping with public speaking. The project said, look, I have a really hard time staying on the script and communicating. My team asked me to come on and get help to be a more persuasive communicator on behalf of the organization. So I talked with him, and the more we talked, the more I realized two things. One was they were asking him to be a very strict, I always call classical speaker, with someone who can read a script sort of line by line and word for word, which are super like that. But he really was more of a jazz speaker, someone who improvises on a theme. And so that was issue number one. That was easy to fix. The other one, though, was a little bit more interesting, which was that he hadn't thought about what he was really there to do, which was to persuade donors and partners and people to support his organization to work with him. So I said, listen, let's talk about that second thing. And the more we explored this issue, the more I realized he could benefit from a kind of refresher course on what is persuasion. And the material that I prepared for him came from a very old book called The Rhetoric, written by a philosopher named Aristotle 2,500 or so years ago, which is the first book that we have on persuasion. And I made a PowerPoint deck with the key ideas from the book. We spent the next 8 weeks going through those, and it was a very successful project. I did a second project with him. Long story short, last year I coached about a dozen senior leaders around the topic of persuasion, and one of them suggested I should write it all down. So that's exactly what I'm doing now. I'm putting all the ideas of the coaching experience into a book for anyone to read.
So I think it's extremely relevant. You know, somebody watching this might say, wait a second, I thought this was an automation and digital transformation association. But you know, I meet so many tech leaders. You know, I probably meet a handful of new startups every week. Really smart, technical people, really smart operations people, but often struggle with being able to articulate their value proposition, to persuade, whether it's in a sales and marketing context, which, as you know, we spend a lot of time in, but even as an investor, you know, pitching investors or just trying to explain to people, you know, what they do in a way that, is articulate enough to communicate the proverbial, elevator pitch, right? So I'm curious, what are the three, there's three things I think Aristotle talks about in his book, but I'm curious as to how you've kind of mapped that to the real world.
Sure. So he says in his book, there are only three ways in which you can persuade someone. One is the character of the speaker. So who are you? Who is speaking, or what is speaking, if it's an organization like a company? The second is the arguments you present: logic, evidence, proofs, witnesses, all the material, hard things that you present to the audience. And third is whatever emotion is aroused in the listener, whatever those happen to be. His take, that was it. And in my book, I explain, I think he was right. Not only that, but he talks about this in the context of speech. In my book, I look at advertising, film, music, media, social media, technology, and it's the same principles at work in every single case. And what I find with business leaders is that they over rely on the second. because of the way they're trained in MBA school and just the way business works, you kind of tend to focus on PowerPoint slides and charts and statistics. And Aristotle would say that's like having a three-masted ship with only one sail. You're leaving two unfurled, right? So the character of the speaker is very important. And then what people feel as you speak to them, and I think you would say it's the most important thing of all. And if you don't use those at all in any way, then you're really hindered at best, and at worst, you overuse argument. And argument is one of those things that people have a hard time following usually. And so I think a lot of senior leaders struggle because they over rely on facts and figures, and they leave aside to other things that are sitting there right for them to use and tend to go ignored in my experience.
Yeah, I think it's a huge issue in technology, right? It's just built into the DNA of technologists to, think about things very binary, truth or not truth, and expect people to buy that way or buy into something that way. And the reality is they don't, right? So what's your advice for someone who, is maybe more of a black and white person and big on the IQ, but not as much on the EQ?
I think the first thing to realize is that the smarter you are and the more you're persuaded by logic and argument, the farther away you are from the average person, right? Almost by definition. So I've coached people who are really love logic, really love argument and statistics. And I try to explain to them that the average person doesn't. And so the more you're convinced by things in that nature, the harder it is for the average person to keep up to you, right? The other thing is, there are always ways to use your own character and your own story and emotion in persuading people. And I'll give you a good example. I'm working right now with a chief digital officer. So a technologist, he's the person who was a CIO, took on a new role in the UK to lead a digital transformation of a global brand. When he called me, he said, I've been here for 6 months and I have a problem. Half my team, which is a 150 something person technology team, half of them think this is irrelevant. The other half think it's impossible. And I'm at my wit's end trying to persuade them to kind of go on this journey with me. And I asked them, well, what part of your story do you use? And he said, I don't. I've always been told that you keep yourself out of the story. And I said, well, let's talk about that. This guy, he comes from Asia. His family struggled and sacrificed to put him through university. He's been a very successful executive. He's overcome all kinds of personal, professional obstacles like all of us have. And none of this amazing story that he has was being used to explain to his team why he took this role and why it was so important. The other thing we discovered was that the person he replaced was well liked by the team. The board didn't think he was the right leader for this transformation effort, but he had left everyone with a good impression. So there was sort of this issue that hadn't been dealt with, which were the feelings of the team. And I explained to him, we need to address those and we need to get the people to feel that emotionally they're committed to this project. And so when we worked together, we sort of reinvented his communication strategy, one, to make it more personal and to explain to the team why his leadership was the right leadership, and also to respect the feelings of the team they have for his predecessor and help them understand why he was the right person for the role. And it was a completely different message. It wasn't just relying on the technology elements or the externalities of the business. When you put it all together, there was this great personal story. There was the acknowledgement of what the team was vested in this project. And then when you add the nuts and bolts of business, it's a much more powerful story.
Yeah, it's a great point you make, right? There's sort of, the traditional persuasion within sales and marketing that, people kind of think of, but there's also the internal selling, right? And some of the other, elements throughout your work and personal life that people don't kind of look at it through that lens. I'm curious what your thoughts are on, from you mentioned advertising and marketing, though. How do you kind of take this advice and put it into practice when you speak to somebody who is really responsible for the sales and marketing?
Well, I think it's important to understand what really persuasion is. I looked at a lot of books getting ready to write mine. A lot of them think of persuasion as kind of winning an argument or closing a deal. And I think that's a secondary effect of being a good persuader. To me, persuasion is about validation at the human level, right? We want people to believe what we believe. We want them to like what we like. We we want to think of us as valuable and what we know is important. And I always tell people I coach, the most important thing to persuade anyone is to start with what must be true in order for you to be believed. And Aristotle says that people don't persuade, truth persuades. So he describes persuasion as a demonstration something is true. This is an incredibly important point for executives. They oftentimes will not stop to think what must be true, irrespective of me, for this person to believe what I'm going to ask him to believe, to buy something, or take on a project, or to change something they're doing. So you start with that, then you ask yourself, okay, what can I tell you or show you that demonstrates the truth of this statement? If I can do that well, I will persuade. Right, that's really what it's about. And the other thing I think for senior leaders is there's a very gray area between persuasion, I would say, and coercion.
Right.
And too often leaders claim they persuade when they really coerce. And I coach people and I say, if you left tomorrow, would your idea persist? Would your project continue? If it would not, if your project and your values and your ideas walk out the door with you, you're probably coercing a little more than you think. Right, so those are 2 points to keep in mind as you think about leadership within an organization or with customers, saying what must be true for someone to buy this project, right, or this solution.
But so Carlos, but one of the three pillars is also a credibility, right, and character, right? So you see this in big brands, right, that they're trying to establish, thought leadership and credibility. How do you do this if you're not as well known?
Character has so many different parts to it, right? And people, I think for the most part, start with the idea of believing what you say to them. This brings up the issue of authenticity, which I think people get sometimes wrong. And in my book, I argue that the best way, I think, to think about authenticity is to score an audience gives you. Let's say I say to you, I'm from Philadelphia. And as we start communicating, I didn't know Drexel was there. I'm surprised it was the river, right? I've never had a cheesesteak at Pat's. Suddenly, let's say you gave me a score of 1, the Philly score starts to click down to 0.8, 0.7, 0.5. If I keep going, by the time we're done, you think I've never been to Philadelphia. The other way happens too, which is I haven't mentioned Philadelphia, and I mentioned UPenn, the Bo Hudson, the Schuylkill, right? The Franklin Institute. Pretty soon you say, hey, are you from Philly? And I go, born and bred. Suddenly my score goes up. I think the same thing happens in business. If you make claims that the audience isn't going to believe and you overstate those claims, you wind up hurting yourself. If you start with, these are the things that I do well, and let the audience begin to put value on those things, then the score starts at 0 and goes up from there. And it's better to go from 0 to 0.4 than 10 to 0.6, right? So I think when you communicate what you do and what you know, my advice is don't overstate the claim. The audiences are pretty good at knowing that. Let what you know come out in the conversation, and they themselves will begin to think of you as a thought leader or as someone who's worthy of trust and being believed.
So Carlos, I'd be remiss running an automation and AI association if I didn't ask you about your recent article, Can Machines Persuade? So what say you?
Well, it just came out of a lecture I gave, and someone in the audience asked me, is persuasion a uniquely human thing? And I said, well, it depends if you believe in God, because if you believe in God, then it isn't, because in every major religion, there are examples of God's trying to persuade us of the number of commandments or certain ways to live. But then he said, what about a machine? Can a machine persuade? And I hadn't thought about this. So I began to do some research, and I found that IBM had a thing called Project Debater. It was sort of like Watson in Jeopardy, except it was supposed to beat a human debater. Long story short, was the machine did not win. And the IBM team felt that, at least for the time being, persuasion still remains a human trait. They found it was much harder to win a debate than to win a game of chess or to win a game of Go. What's going on in the human brain is much more complicated. So I think for now, the answer is machines can't. But of course, a lot of things they couldn't do 20 years ago that they can do today. So maybe in 20 years, it'll be a different answer.
Oh, good. Maybe that's still our differentiator.
There you go.
I guess,
We're still unique in that sense for now.
Exactly. Exactly. Carlos, real quick, I know we're out of time, but give us a plug for the book. What's the name and where can people get it?
The book is called The Rules of Persuasion. It'll be available later this year. In the meantime, I have a newsletter on Substack. You can look it up under my name, called The Rules of Persuasion, in which I explain things in the news and other items that will appear later on in the book. So if you want to begin to follow the persuasion conversation, you can find it that way or through LinkedIn. Look me up on LinkedIn and you'll see it next to my profile as well. Thank you, Dan.
Carlos, thanks so much.
Thank you much. Bye-bye.